Imagine trusting someone who holds your health, your dignity, and even your life in their very own hands, only to find out that the trust was a calculated lie. For 40 years, hundreds of black men in Alabama believed that they were receiving treatment for quote-unquote bad blood, a vague term used to cover up a horrifying secret, but in reality, they were part of one of the most appalling human experiments in American history. There was no treatment, no consent, no humanity, just a series of lies spanning decades, all in the name of science. How could this happen, and who was behind it? Today, we're going to be diving into the dark truths of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, where ethics were thrown aside and lives were sacrificed for a medical study that would change the landscape of trust in healthcare forever. Hey everyone, my name is Chichi. I am a physiotherapist and I am a true crime enthusiast. On this channel, I'll be focusing on medical true crime cases, medical mysteries, and medical histories. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, which started in 1932 to 1972, was a notorious medical research history that was conducted by the United States Public Health Service in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study aimed to investigate the natural progression of syphilis in African American men without treating them. Researchers sought to understand the disease effect on the human body over time. However, was this medical experiment and study worth the hundreds of lives that were lost? First of all, we're going to get briefly into the post-World War I because it was a series of events that led to the Tuskegee experiment. During this period, the Great Migration also took place, where millions of black Americans began moving from the rural south to the urban north in search of better economic opportunities and relief from harsh segregationist policies. However, while northern cities offered more industrial jobs, discrimination still persisted. Black Americans were often limited to low-paying jobs and crowded into segregated neighborhoods. Tensions occasionally led to mayhem as some white residents felt threatened by the new black labor force and culture entering their communities. In response to this systemic oppression, the Black American and civil rights organization like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began mobilizing to fight for equality. Figures like Ida B. Wells were instrumental in raising awareness against the injustice of the lynching and segregation, laying the groundwork for later civil rights movements. However, the majority of the nation was resistant to significant changes, allowing segregation to continue largely unchallenged throughout the 20th century. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it brought about widespread economic devastation, with the unemployment rate reaching unprecedented levels. The Depression affected all Americans, but its impact was especially harsh on the black communities, who were often the last to be hired and the first to be fired. This collapse excavated existing racial and economic inequalities and worsened the living conditions for black Americans who were already struggling under discriminatory policies. In the job market, black workers faced intense discrimination. As the job became scarce, black workers were frequently displaced by their white workers who was willing to accept lower wages. Many black Americans, particularly in the South, were employed in sharecropping or low-wage labor, leaving them vulnerable to economic downturns. In the North, while black workers had migrated for industrial jobs, these opportunities dwindled during the Depression, leading to severe unemployment within the black urban communities. During the Depression, however, President Franklin Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of programs designed to provide relief and economic recovery. However, these programs often excluded black workers. For instance, the Social Security Act initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, two of the primary employment sectors for black Americans. Public work programs that did not hire black Americans frequently paid them low wages than their white counterparts, reinforcing the racial and economic divide. The economic strain of the Great Depression saw an increase in oppression, which included lynchings. Black Americans in the South were frequently victims of intimidation, with lynching rates spiking as economic conditions deteriorated. Despite this widespread public horror, anti-lynching legislations failed to pass in the Congress due to the Southern's opposition, further demonstrating the government's failure to protect their black citizens back in the day. The racial segregation and economic discrimination that defined the post-World War I era and the Great Depression had lasting effects on the African American community. This pattern laid a foundation for systemic inequalities that persisted into the civil rights era and beyond. Economic and social disparities that emerged during this time contributed to the racial wealth gap, the disparities in education, health and housing, and even an ingrained mistrust of institutions among Black Americans, especially in the medical field, a sentiment reinforced by events like the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment in later years. So just in case you don't know, Macon County, Alabama in the early 20th century was one of the most impoverished and educationally disadvantaged regions in the United States, a situation that made it a prime location for the unethical Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. The intersection of poverty, the summers, the dusty roads, and the crumbling shacks lined the rural landscape of the Macon County. Limited educational opportunities and segregation in Macon County created conditions where many Black residents had little access to adequate health care or even knowledge necessary to question the motives of those offering medical assistance. Macon County, located in the heart of Alabama, had an overwhelmingly Black population during the early 20th century, with most residents living in extreme poverty. A majority worked as sharecroppers or even tenant farmers, laboring on land they did not own, bound by debts and economic dependency on white landowners. This form of employment was common in the post-Civil War, where many Black Americans were left with few options beside sharecropping, as the systemic racism prevented them from gaining wealth or accessing better jobs. The economic conditions in Macon County were such that even basic needs were often unmet. Many families lived without electricity, indoor plumbing, or reliable sources of income. The financial hardship experienced by these families left them in a very vulnerable position, relying on community resources or outside assistance for healthcare or educational opportunities. Given their economic situation, most residents could not afford a private medical care and often relied on county or federally funded programs for healthcare access, a dependency that would later be exploited by the Tuskegee study. Education in Macon County was similarly limited, especially for Black residents. Segregated schooling policies severely disadvantaged Black students who attended poorly funded schools with limited resources, overcrowded classrooms, and even an inadequate number of qualified teachers. Schools for Black children received significantly less public funding than other schools, and many Black children had to leave school early to help support their families, further reducing their chances of attaining education. This lack of educational resources made it difficult for Black residents to acquire knowledge about science, medicine, and their rights as citizens. Many had limited health literacy, meaning they had little understanding of medical terminologies or conditions like syphilis. This lack of education contributed to a dependency on medical professionals, as most patients could not easily access or interpret information on their own health conditions. In addition to this, healthcare in Macon County, as much as the rural South, was insufficient for Black population who faced high rates of diseases, malnutrition, and untreated health conditions. Syphilis in particular was a prevalent disease in Macon County at the time, largely untreated due to the high cost of healthcare and lack of medical facilities. Of course, with limited options for healthcare, many residents had little choice but to rely on public initiatives and government-funded programs, even if they were poorly resourced or inequitable. These conditions set the stage for the Public Health Service to launch the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment in 1932. Syphilis was a serious and widespread public health issue in the early 20th century. By the time the Tuskegee study began in 1932, syphilis was already considered a major health crisis in the United States, particularly affecting rural and impoverished areas with limited access to health care. In the 1930s, it was estimated that around 7% of the US population was infected with syphilis, which is a bacterial infection caused by Treponema pallidum. That being said, the poverty and lack of education in Macon County played a critical role in the Tuskegee's experiment success in manipulating its participants. Many of the men enrolled in the study were eager for any form of medical attention and trusted the healthcare providers. They assumed that they were receiving legitimate treatment with little knowledge about syphilis or the concept of informed consent. They were unable to recognize the dangers of their involvement. There was promise of basic care, meals, and burial insurance for those who participated until DEATH, and these incentives were attractive enough to keep the men enrolled, as these resources were otherwise difficult for them to secure. Without a formal education, many participants did not question why they never were given treatments like penicillin when it became widely available in the 1940s as an effective cure for syphilis. The healthcare providers misled the participants into believing they were receiving treatment, even as going as far as conducting painful procedures like spinal tap under the guise of free special treatment. Their lack of education prevented them from challenging the medical professionals or seeking information from an alternative source. The United States of America Public Healthcare Service launched the Tuskegee study in Macon County, Alabama, intending it to be a short-term project observing untreated syphilis in African American men. Unfortunately, it extended for 40 years. At the time, syphilis was a public healthcare issue, and there was a considerable debate about the most effective treatment, which were often not toxic and highly effective. Initially, they sought to record disease progression without intervening with treatment, intending to study syphilis in poor black men and determine the differences on its effect versus white population. A belief grounded in an harmful racial bias that black people were physiologically different. Like I stated earlier, they recruited 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, which are also known as the controls, without fully disclosing the true nature of the research. Instead, the men were told that they had bad blood, a term that was vaguely used in the local communities to describe a range of ailments. Despite the development of penicillin in the 1940s, which was an effective cure for the syphilis, they continued with the study without treating the participants. An act I think was very, very wicked. They focused on observing how the untreated syphilis affected their body instead of treating human beings. Several key figures were instrumental in the initiation and continuation of the Tuskegee study. The first person was Dr. Taliaferro Clark. As the head of the United States Public Health Service, Venereal Division, Dr. Clark initially advocated for a short-term study. However, he was not in favor of continuing it for decades and left the project in its early stages, while others who were more invested in prolonging the study took over. Then the next person was Dr. Eugene Debo, the head of the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital at the Tuskegee Institute. Dr. Debo was an African-American physician who allowed the study to take place at Tuskegee. While Debo's role wasn't as direct as some others, his approval lent legitimacy to the study, as he was seen as a liaison between the USPHS and the African American community. His involvement is often seen as a tragic example of complicity by the local black professionals in an unethical experiment. Then we have Dr. Raymond as the USPHS officer who replaced Dr. Clark. He was a major advocate for continuing the long-term study. He believed that the progression of untreated syphilis needed to be studied over many years at the expense of people's life. He played a role in the decision to continue withholding treatment even after penicillin became available, prioritizing scientific outcomes over human well-being. And the next person was Dr. John R. Heller. Taking over the venereal disease division, Heller continued the experiment without initiating treatment for the men. Under his directions, the study adopted policies that ensured participants wouldn't receive syphilis treatment from outside providers, which was achieved by distributing lists of study participants to local health organizations, thus ensuring they couldn't access penicillin even if they sought it elsewhere, which I think is very mean and wicked thing to do. And then lastly, we have Dr. Charles Cutler, a controversial figure. Dr. Cutler was not directly involved with the Tuskegee study, but led similarly unethical experiments in Guatemala, infecting prisoners and mental patients with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. His work reflected the same disturbing priorities that led to the abuse of the study with the participants in Tuskegee. The effects of untreated syphilis in the participants were severe and tragic, with the United States Public Health Service documenting the stages as the disease progressed. Syphilis typically progresses through several stages, and will have the first stage, which is the primary stage. This disease begins with sores, which are usually painless at the infection site. For the men in this study, they were often ignored by the researchers as they focused on the long-term effects rather than the earliest symptoms. Then we have the secondary stage. Here, the participants experienced rashes, mucous membrane lesions, and swollen lymph nodes, among other symptoms. Again, no treatment was provided and the only symptoms were just recorded. Then comes the latent stage. During this stage, the men might have not shown symptoms for years while the bacteria was silently attacking their organs. The study took advantage of this stage as the lack of visible symptoms helped justify the withholding of this treatment. They were like, oh, okay, so there's no symptoms, so why should we give them penicillin? I mean, you can imagine. And lastly was the tertiary stage. As the disease advanced untreated, the men suffered from neurological, cardiovascular, and other systemic complications. Many experienced blindness, dementia, paralysis, and even heart failure. It wasn't until 1972 that Peter Buxton, a former PHS employee and a whistleblower, finally brought the study to public attention because he was like, this is very mean. For 4 decades, Buxton had learned of the experiment and was disturbed by its ethical violations. And after his internal complaints were ignored, he leaked the information to the press, and as an explosive article in the Washington Star exposed the horrifying details, the media outcry was immediate and intense, leading to national outrage and forcing the government to end the study. Unfortunately, 128 men were already, unalived from the syphilis and its complication, together with their spouses. You can imagine the anguish of watching their loved ones suffer, the desperation of seeking help that never came, and the crippling fear of being trapped in a system designed to exploit and harm them. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study legacy is a painful reminder of medical racism and ethical negligence. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the victims and their family on behalf of the United States government, acknowledging the suffering caused by the study and pledging reforms to protect human rights in research. Throughout the study, it is also worthy to note that the participants were never given treatment, but these placebos or inadequate remedies had no real impact on their disease. And I decided that it was necessary to bring out some of the treatments that they were given, and they included mercury and bismuth. Earlier in the study, researchers administered small doses of these substances. Although mercury and bismuth were used in syphilis treatment before the discovery of penicillin, the doses given in Tuskegee were too low to be therapeutic. Mercury, a toxic metal, was known to cause side and harmful effects and was largely ineffective, which researchers likely understood and used it to their advantage. Then the next one was placebos. The USPHS administered inert treatment that provided no medical benefits, ensuring that the participants would still show symptoms for study purposes. The men believed that they were receiving a real medical care, a belief reinforced by regular follow-up visits from doctors and nurses. Something I feel like is very, very unethical, very wicked, and very mean. By using this ineffective treatment, the researchers created an illusion of care that kept the men engaged in the study because obviously there was continued medical visits. So they were like, oh, these people really cared about us, while intentionally withholding actual therapy. In 1947, penicillin became widely accepted as an effective and accessible treatment for syphilis. However, despite the availability, these medical officers from the government decided that no, we're not giving them penicillin because they wanted to obtain their study and endanger human rights. As the study continued, it became increasingly clear that the men were not receiving care or support to manage their health. Instead, they were given annual checkups by the USPHS and the Tuskegee Institute staff, reinforcing the illusion, like always, that their health was being monitored and managed. And this kept the men reliant on the study team and deterred them from seeking other medical advice. But meanwhile, what could they have even done, even if they sought medical advice? They couldn't have gotten the penicillin or medical advice from somewhere. Anyways, the deceit and exploitation within the Tuskegee syphilis study shattered trust between the African Americans and the medical community. The lack of informed consent and the administration of placebos and deprivation of effective treatment created a legacy of mistrust in the healthcare that persists up until today. When the study was publicly exposed in 1972, it led to the establishment of institutional review boards to protect human subjects in research. It also prompted critical discussions on medical ethics, particularly around vulnerable populations, informed consent, and the protection of research subjects from harm. In essence, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment represented a complete failure to respect the autonomy, the dignity, and health of its participants. It remains a stark reminder of the importance of ethical sight in research and the devastating consequences of its absence. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, which ran from 1932 to 1972, became one of the most notorious examples of medical ethics violation in the American history. It is also worthy to note that as these men suffered the consequences of syphilis, syphilis is also congenital, meaning it can be passed down from mother to child. So many wives and children were indirectly affected during the span of 40 years, with newborns sometimes contracting the disease at birth. By the study's end, over 100 men died from complications relating to syphilis, while countless others endured years of suffering without understanding the true cause. The government's effort to keep the study going was extensive and calculated. For 4 decades, leaders within the public health service, including the CDC and even prominent physicians, concealed critical information, blocking men from accessing healthcare elsewhere. In the 1960s, after the new discussions on ethical standards in research, came up, some officers expressed discomfort with the study, yet it was allowed to continue. Ironically, the study was often cited in public health discussions, yet its true nature was misinterpreted to maintain a front of legitimacy. This exposure marked a turning point with the US government launching an investigation and resulting in a class action lawsuit filed by the survivors and the family of the deceased participants. In 1974, a $10 million settlement was reached and legislation was passed to ensure stricter oversight on human research, giving rise to institutional review boards to prevent similar abuses in the future. We have come to the end of today's video. Please, if you really like it, I would appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, and share if you care. Tell me your opinions in the comment section down below. I'd really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.